Okay, folks, today I want to talk about the book Made in China, The Long Way to a Modern Chinese Economy. This book is published by Feniks, and teachers use this book on Dutch secondary schools in their history classes, mainly in VWO 5. First, I want to discuss briefly some prior knowledge. China is a country in East Asia and still one of the few communist countries in the world. They have a socialist market economy. Basically, they have a market economy, and that's quite rare because usually communist countries had and has a planned economy. For example, entrepreneurs are allowed to make some profits and reinvest those profits, but under strict state control. China is the most populated country in the world with a population of almost 1.4 billion people. China is a multi-ethnic state. There are 65 ethnical groups in China. The largest one are the Han Chinese, and they mainly live in the central and southeast regions of the country. Those regions are also the economic heartland of China. Today, China is one of the world's superpowers. Since 2018, they have a trade war with the United States. The main reason is, according to the Trump administration, the negative import and export balance between the two countries is hurting the US economy. Phoenix is discussing in the introduction the research question and the sub-questions. They use these questions to structure the chapters of the booklet. The research question is, why did it take so long, the end of the 20th century, for China to industrialize? The sub-questions are, what kind of society was 18th century China and how did the economy function? Why China didn't modernize in the 19th century? What was the point of view of the nationalist and the communist movement on modernization in China? How did Mao Zedong tribute to the modernization of the Chinese economy? And what were the causes and the consequences of the industrialization after the death of Mao? The first chapter talks about what kind of society 18th century China was and how did the economy function. First of all, China saw itself in the 18th century as the center of the earth. The Chinese Empire was also called the Middle Kingdom. The countries surrounding China were subordinate states through the eyes of the Chinese rulers. You can see this clearly on an old Chinese map made around 1500 AD. As you see, China is laying in the center of the world. Confucius was a Chinese philosopher who lived around 500 BC. His philosophy, Confucianism, played an important role in Chinese society for almost 2000 years. Confucianism is based on a strict social hierarchy in people, their personal relationships, and society as a whole. If you look to the first picture, social order in personal relationships, you can see that a father and a husband, basically the head of the family, is the boss and that everybody is obedient to him. If you look to the second picture that portrays social hierarchy in 18th century Chinese society, you can see that the merchants and the traders are the lowest class. That's actually surprising because in most ancient societies, the farmers and the peasants are the lowest class. The emperor stood at the top of the 18th century Chinese society. He ruled the mandate of heaven. According to Confucius, he was the mediator between heaven and earth. He was the ruler of every person in China, but subordinate to heaven. The official title of the emperor was Son of Heaven. The act of sacrificing was central to the emperorship. The emperor could provoke fury among the gods in heaven if he wasn't able to fulfill this task. Natural disasters was a way to express their anger and a clear sign that the emperor was losing his grasp on power. Now I want to discuss some extra information that's not written in the booklet of Feniks. Sacrificing humans. Humans were sacrificed in ancient China. In the upper classes, for example, the deceased one was sometimes buried with his wife, servants and slaves, so they could serve their husband and their master in the afterlife. According to some sources, human sacrifice was officially abolished in 384 BC by the order of Duke Xian of Qin, but other historians say that human sacrifice only came to an end when a decree was issued by Emperor Qianxi in 1673 AD that officially banned this practice. The first Chinese emperor, who died in 210 BC, was not buried with humans, but with more than 8,000 terracotta soldiers. They were buried with him to protect him in the afterlife. The emperor was the absolute ruler in 18th century China. He ruled the country by decree, and he was also the highest judge. For example, all the death penalties given by the Mandarin judges had to be approved by the emperor. At the top of 18th century Chinese society were the mandarins, the so-called Shi class. These government officials were the bureaucrats of China and were governing the 18 provinces of the country. In theory, every young man in China could become a mandarin, but it was extremely difficult to pass the several exams. Only those who received the highest marks were qualified to become a mandarin. The Chinese economy in the 18th century was mainly self-sufficient and self-supporting. They were not dependent on products and resources from other countries. The largest class in 18th century Chinese society were the farmers and the peasants, the so-called non-class. More than 80% of the Chinese population was living and working on the land. They were mainly growing rice, grains and also cotton for the clothing industry. Since the 17th century, the Chinese population increased rapidly, so there were a lot of people to work on the fields. Inside the non-class there was a distinction between the rich farmers, the landowners and the peasants. The rich farmers and the landowners made out of 10% of the Chinese population, but they possessed more than 75% of the farmland. Most peasants worked and lived under their command. Many times I get a question, "Sir, what's the difference between a peasant and a farmer?" I try to give a brief definition. A peasant is part of the working class. He is a poor agricultural laborer who doesn't possess any farmland. A farmer, part of the owning class, possesses the farmland where he or his laborers are working on. Most peasants in 18th century China lived alive in poverty and were vulnerable to natural disasters, such as floods and droughts. Famines that broke out as a result of these events triggered many times peasant revolts and were threatening the position of the emperor. The Chinese government tried to prevent famines by setting up a system of large grain storages. In the 18th century, this system almost reached a state of perfection. The craftsmen and the artisans, the so-called gong class, usually had their workshops near to the local markets and in or around the major cities. Chinese ceramics were in the 18th century already world famous and very valuable. The right picture shows a plate of Chinese porcelain. Now, Chinese porcelain was outside China extremely expensive. According to Confucius, the merchants and the traders were belonging to the lowest social class, the so-called Shang class, mainly because they didn't produce anything. They were only transporting commodities from one place to another. Among the merchants and the traders, the salt merchants were the most wealthiest, because the Chinese government had a monopoly on salt. In order to obtain a license to sell salt, merchants had to pay a large amount of money. I mentioned earlier that the Chinese economy was self-sufficient and self-supporting. but China was trading with foreign nations in the 18th century. Surrounding nations like Korea or Vietnam were sending a tribute to the emperor. By doing this, they could count on Chinese military support and they were allowed to import a certain amount of Chinese products. It was different with the European nations. From 1757 onwards, Canton was the only port where European merchants could buy Chinese products. They had to pay with silver because the Chinese weren't interested in European products. Last but not least, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Vergeet je niet te abonneren op mijn YouTube kanaal.